I'm an unabashed fan of a well-written recipe, and a lot of the times the cookbooks that I review get a favorable review from me based on how well the recipes are written. So I've sort of narrowed it down into 4 areas that you could pay attention to, and I would say at this time of year, when you might be getting together a family cookbook as a present, or if you want to share a really good recipe with somebody else, it's just good to have some basics to make sure that the recipe, that the dish that you make is well explained enough in the recipe that you write. So if you start with a head note first, it needs to sort of explain the title of the recipe. If, for example, it's called, Aunt Fanny's fudge mistake, it's kind of funny, and you'd want to know what the mistake was and where it came from. And you would make sure, of course, to mention where you got the recipe, even if you sort of adapted it from something else. You want to make sure that if there are any substitutions or if there are any hard to find ingredients, you give people a clue about where those could be or what those could be. It would be helpful for people to understand also whether or not the dish could be made in advance, or if it could be frozen, or how long it'll even last in the refrigerator. These are things that I've found that people are really looking for these days. For the ingredients themselves, of course, if you're a close reader of cookbooks, you know that listing the ingredients in order of how they're used in the directions is the key thing. I really can't stress that enough. You'd be surprised at recipes that I get from chefs submitted to the Washington Post that really don't follow that. They sort of have different priorities in mind. But for you and me, listing them in the order of how you use them is the way to go. If the recipe has parts, like if one part is a crust and one part is a filling, you'd want to label those separately. And you don't want to assume that what people have on hand is the ingredient that you're asking for. So instead of, say, calling for 1 egg, you could call for 1 large egg. Or instead of saying a half a stick of butter, you'd say unsalted or salted butter, things like that. Next is the directions. Obviously, they need to follow in the order that you saw it in the ingredients. So you'd write each step in its own little separate paragraph, and I tend to think you don't really have to number those. People generally read from the top to the bottom. And then you think about any techniques or special equipment that they might need. You want to use terms that you think everybody will understand. The key part about the directions is you want to hand these over to someone who cooks regularly, a friend of yours, and you want to see whether they can follow the directions, whether they're easy to understand, maybe ask them to make the dish for you. And last, for a photo or video which accompanies so many recipes online these days, it's really important to try to picture exactly what's in the photo, match what's in the photo or video with what's in the ingredients and directions. You'd be surprised at the number of times maybe, an herb like basil will pop up at the end and you didn't see it. Some people use things for garnish, and if they're not mentioned, that's kind of a turnoff for readers. So I would say, just to make things clear, make sure it all matches up, and you'll have written yourself a great recipe.